Now, I've done a bit of house cleaning on our Ubuntu host, so we need to quickly spin up a container that we can use for this demo. We'll call it net2 this time, and we'll still base it on our net.img image. Anyway, we want to be on the host CLI for this bit, so let's docker inspect our new container. And that's what we want there, network settings. First up, we can see our bridge is listed as Docker 0, and our gateway, well, that's what we saw a minute ago when we did a trace route to the internet from the net1 container. Now, all containers on this host will get the same default gateway, which will be the address of our Docker 0 interface in the host namespace. Yeah, there it is there. Anyway, if we go back to the Docker inspect, we can see the IP address of the container too, and there's the length of its net mask, 16 bits, or an old Class B address. MAC address there, and for this particular container, we don't have any ports mapped, but we'll see that in the next lesson. Now there's also a couple of network-related config files kicking around behind the scenes that I think are worth knowing too. But first up, let's get the ID of our container. Okay, now if we take a look in var lib docker containers, remember, this is where our container metadata and the likes live. And this is our container ID here, so if we tab complete that, yeah, a handful of files. And these two are the ones that we're interested in right now, hosts and resolve.conf. Sound familiar to anyone? Well, it should come as no surprise to anyone to see that resolve.conf, well, it looks exactly what we'd expect it to look like. We've got a single DNS server, Google's used and abused 8.8.8.8, and if we do this too, this is the resolve.conf file from the Docker host. Kinda looks the same, yeah? Well, by default, resolve.conf for every container on the host is just a straight copy of the resolve.conf file from the host that it's running on. Though, we can override both of these values here in resolve.conf, so the list of DNS servers and the DNS search domains, we can override them with arguments on the docker run command line. Anyway, what about the hosts file? No surprises there either. IPv4 and IPv6 name resolution. Now, with recent versions of Docker, it is actually allowed to edit these two files on the fly, so while a container is up and running. But be warned, right? On-the-fly changes we make like this are only effective while the container is running. They don't persist container restarts. Now, a second ago, we said we could override some of these default settings, where a container automatically gets resolve.conf and hosts files from the host it's running on. Well, let's see how to override the default DNS settings from the Docker run CLI. And we give the option --DNS equals, and this time we'll go with Google's slightly less abused name server. We'll call our image DNS test, and we'll use the same net.img image. Docker inspect DNS test. Scroll up a bit. There we go. Now, a quick question before we move on. How come, right? If we can base multiple containers off a single image, how come each container can have its own resolve.conf and hosts files? I mean, surely those files are in the image and have to be the same for all containers based off that image, yeah? Well, behind the scenes, every container gets its very own resolve.conf and hosts files overlaid over the top of the resolve.conf and hosts files that exist in the image and therefore the union file system of the container. So those files exist inside of the image. When we spin up a container, yes, they're there inside of the container, but then on top of them, we overlay new files. And this can kind of be seen if we look at proc mounts or the mount table from within the container. Anyway, next up, we'll look at how to expose network ports and services from inside of a container to the outside world.